Good evening. Last week when we met, we were discussing the switch in commercial patterns because of the collapse of the Roman Empire. But there was also influences of the Han Dynasty's collapse as well. So what's going to happen is the Silk Road that had been the predominant means of exchange throughout most of the classical period will fall into disuse, primarily because of robberies along the Silk Road, banditry. Bandits found it easier to plunder and to steal from caravans than they did to actually go out and make their own livings. And it was an easy means of procurement. So scavenging caravans was an easy and beneficial means of support for many, particularly nomadic groups. So we talked about the Silk Road and the fact that during the Silk Road it had been protected primarily because of the Roman Empire. The empire had set up outposts every 20 miles or so along the Silk Road to protect those caravans that were traveling. It also provided a means of people who found it necessary to travel, other reasons of business, that they could travel in relative safety along the Silk Road. It was protected only approximate to China by the Han Empire, dynasty. It was primarily protected by the Romans. So you have to understand that. So when the collapse of Rome came in 476 CE, then it was inevitable that the safety of the road would falter and the road would fall into disuse. But we also explained that the importance of the road was not just for means of commerce, but also because of the exchange of technology, cultural ideas, religious beliefs, and it supported a lot of people economically. And for that reason, when it did falter and fall into disuse, they had to find a means to work around it. And so therefore, for that reason, the Indian Ocean came into prominence as the means of exchange during the early, from the early medieval period throughout the Renaissance. Okay, now China, we explained that China, because of its proximity to Southeast Asian countries, and we discussed those countries, Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, were all influenced in some way by their proximity to China. However, there were three specific cultures that are influenced indelibly by their exposure to China. And these become known as Chinese little brother nations or tribute nations. Now, what we mean by tribute nations is that these particular states paid a tax to China for several reasons. They paid a tax to China in order that they had the ability to trade with China. In other words, China would refuse to trade with them unless they paid this tax or tribute. They were also influenced culturally by China as far as Confucianism, Taoism, the Chinese alphabet, Chinese social practices, and those types of things. And these countries were Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. And the interesting thing about these is that they were all independent states. They had their own government systems. They had their own languages, cultural beliefs and ideas, own styles of dress. They were sedentary agricultural societies. They were not nomadic groups such as the Mongols or Manchurians who made incursions into China, but rather these were settled groups of people from whom China actually procured ideas and developments. For example, we know that the cultivation of rice came into China probably from Vietnam. So each one of these states was in some way influenced by China. The one primarily influenced Korea, and the reason for that was the Korean peninsula is contiguous. That means it is connected to the Chinese mainland. And actually, the Korean peninsula is made up of 3 independent principalities or monarchies, Silla, Ito, and Goryeo. And we think it's from the Principality of Goryeo that the word Korea was derived from. Under the Han Dynasty, during 221 BCE to 220 CE, northern Korea was taken under the political control of China. Now, when the Koreans were not fighting among themselves, what they would do would be to provide a unified force against China to try to keep China out. But their constant infighting with one another led to the instability, political instability within northern China during the period of the Han. So China was actually able to make incursions into and control politically northern China. This influence by China will be resisted somewhat because while the Koreans would adopt and adapt Confucianism to their own social, their own cultural idea system, women in Korea had a lot more rights than did those women in China. However, once the influences of Confucianism were adopted by the Korean people, then the women of Korea will come under the patriarchal system that was so prevalent within China. Despite the Chinese influence, Korea will eventually drive the Chinese out in the collapse of the Han period around 220 CE. And what this means is that Korea will then reinstate its own political system. Now, despite that, you have to understand that these 3 Korean principalities or monarchies will continue to fight among themselves for political dominance within the peninsula. One thing that the Chinese were able to do, even though they introduced Confucianism into Korea, and the Koreans adopted Confucianism into their cultural system, was that the Koreans resisted the Chinese alphabet and they resisted the Chinese writing system so that they maintained their own writing system as the principal means of communication and standardization within Korea. Now, the relationship of China with Vietnam is going to be a little bit different. China, once again, if you come down southeastern coast of China, it is contiguous with Vietnam. And for about 1,000 years, Vietnam is going to come under the political and cultural control of Chinese dominance. What this means is that Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism become very prevalent within the cultural systems in Vietnam. The Vietnamese also adopt the Chinese political system. In other words, they establish a system where their monarch or leader is known as the Son of Heaven, and they adopt a system of the Mandate of Heaven. It's not as dominant as it is in the Chinese state. However, it does exist within Vietnam. Now, the interesting thing about Vietnam is that women in Vietnam were much more politically independent and socially independent than were the women of China. So even though Confucianism is adopted within Vietnam society, women within the society will maintain their independence. The interesting thing about Vietnamese society is that education was limited almost exclusively to females, and there was a reason for that. In Vietnam, women were the merchants and purveyors. In other words, men did not run businesses in Vietnam. It was seen beneath their dignity. And so women had control of most, if not all, businesses within Vietnam. For that reason, they had to become literate. And the Vietnamese would adopt a literary system very similar to that of the Chinese, but it was the women who became literate within Vietnamese society. Now, another interesting thing is that women were also militarily active within Vietnamese society. This is most evidently demonstrated in the uprising when around 40 CE, Vietnamese tried to overthrow Chinese rule. It was led by the Trung sisters. Trung sisters, T-R-U-N-G, the Trung sisters were very successful in stirring up uprisings throughout all of coastal Vietnam, and so that while they were not able to completely overthrow Chinese dominance and political control, they did make a significant dent in Chinese honor, if you will. Okay. Then the third state that we want to talk about, Japan and China. Now, these are all considered China's little brothers, and in conversely, China is considered their big brother. So that if they're ever willing to become in touch with, politically, they have to follow a certain protocol in addressing their big brother. They would behave a certain way in the Chinese court. They would dress a certain way for the Chinese court, and they would behave in complete Confucian style, as was expected by the Chinese court imperial life. Now, Japan is a little bit different. Japan is separated from China by the China Sea, so it's separated by water by about 100 miles. Japan, as you understand, is an island nation. And it's a very fertile area, very hilly land, but yet very fertile area because it's surrounded by water. They're also, have fisheries. There are navigators. And so in the 9th century, the Japanese themselves determined that they were going to send ambassadors to the Chinese court. There's a reason for this. To the outside world, the Chinese seemed to have their game together. They seemed to be able to hold tight political control through their bureaucratic system, through their mandate of heaven, through the rule of their emperor, who actually ruled through the mandate of heaven. And so it seemed to the outside world that China was almost a seamless entity. In other words, it went from one dynasty to another with with very little complication. Well, that was not so, as we know historically now. But to the outside world, it would appear as such. And so the Japanese recognized this, and so they determined that they wanted to learn what this culture was like and how they themselves could adopt and adapt Chinese culture, political influences, social networking into Japan to emulate what they considered a very prestigious big brother state. And so from the 7th, which is 600s, through the 9th century, you would find Japanese ambassadors within the imperial Chinese court to learn everything that they could about the Chinese imperial system, the Chinese education system, Confucianism, whatever it took to make China run as ideally as the Japanese perceived it to be. And so what the Japanese are going to do is they're going to take that Chinese system of the mandate of heaven, and they're going to replicate that within Japan. The difference being that once the Japanese adopted this system and adapted it to their own culture, the Japanese made it a hereditary state. In other words, when the emperor, whom they determined to be defined by the mandate of heaven, died, it was only his successor that would be able to accede to the throne of Japan. So it became hereditary succession. Remember, China did not practice hereditary succession. China had a system of overthrowing those dynasties that seemed imperfect, that were not ruling as heaven, as they were esteemed heaven would want them to rule. And so therefore there was no actual hereditary succession in China, as there was in Japan. Now, the cultural system of China, Confucianism, was adopted very heavily into Japanese culture. And from this point on, from the early medieval period, the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, Confucianism dominates Japanese culture, family, society, etc. And so therefore, what emerges is a very patriarchal system, social system, that puts women in a very defined state within Japan. Women would be seen and not heard. They had a specific state. They were supposed to dress a specific way. Their sole purpose was for reproduction and for pleasing their husband, or in the case of concubines, their master. An interesting thing that the Japanese did, and would seem nigh on to impossible to us if you consider the Japanese and Chinese languages. I ask you for a moment just to think about Japanese words: Hiroshima, Okinawa. Let's see what else. Their words seemed to flow. Tokugawa. There's a flow to them. Consider Chinese words: Jiao, Zhou, Qi. They're very succinct. They're very abrupt. Despite this, the Japanese adopted the Chinese writing system and impressed this system upon their own language, so that they ended up with a system that looks very similar to the Chinese language system, writing system, but in fact they adapted it to their very melodic language. So the influences of China cannot be underestimated when you think about Southeast Asia in toto, and even parts of the Middle East, the very extreme eastern parts of the Middle East and India, that would have some cultural influences of China, particularly through their commercial dealings. But I ask you now to turn your frame of reference away from the Eastern world and look more to the West and consider early Christendom. Now, we all know, we understand that Christendom developed in the Middle East. It's going to have influences of, through its development, influences of the West by means of Rome, and influences of the Middle East because of its position within the world. When the Christian church developed, because it developed within the confines of the Roman Empire, what the church did was to adapt its political structure upon that it was familiar with, and that, of course, was the Roman Empire. By placing, in the empire, you would have course, the emperor, but then in every province you would have a governor. Well, the church did something very similar. They divided the church into entities known as dioceses. And over each one of these dioceses was a bishop who actually controlled that area, who was the source of authority for the priests and other church members within that area, who of course would turn, in collaboration to his fellow bishops for ironing out problems within the early church. Now we know that the early church was rife with many difficulties, that the fact that the church was trying to make sense, first of all, of who was Jesus. Was he in fact God? Was he divine? Was he human? Was he both human and divine? And so you would have different heresies emerging, such as the Arian heresy, which professed that Jesus was human and then divine, but his humanity preceded his divinity. And all these different issues that emerged about the belief systems or doctrines that we must believe as Christians in the early church were settled in collaboration by the bishops of the church. Now, when the church was initially formed, there were 4 dioceses within Christendom, and they were Syria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome. And I'm off here, guys. Antioch is actually in Syria. The 4th one was actually in, I'm going to say it was, I really forget. I have to look that up for you, and I will let you know. But Antioch was actually in Syria. The fact is that 3 of these dioceses were predominantly in what we refer to as the Middle East. And this is going to cause a problem within the church and will eventually be the reason that the church divides into what's known as the schism within the church, breaking the church into the Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. But at any rate, the 3 early dioceses lay in the Middle East with 1 diocese in the West. The fact that all of these bishops were equal in their control, their power, their authority, and that all problems were ironed out within the church in councils or meetings of all the bishops of the church. For instance, you are probably familiar with or at least heard of the Vatican Council that took place in the early 1960s that changed how we, hear the Mass today, how the Mass how it changed to the vernacular language from the Latin language. And different changes were made in the Mass that made the sacrifice more relevant to people practicing Catholic Christianity. What's going to happen is with the collapse of the Roman Empire in 476 CE, the Roman Empire in the West is completely cut off from the remnants of the empire that persist in the East. Now this gets to be a little bit confusing because what happens is in the West, the Bishop of Rome, who is actually equal in authority to the 3 bishops in, oh, you know what, I remember what it was. It's Constantinople or Byzantine, or that eventually becomes Constantinople. So the 4 were Antioch, Jerusalem, and Byzantium, or what eventually becomes known as Constantinople and Rome. Now, because due to the collapse of the Roman Empire, the western part of the world is completely cut off from the remaining dioceses within the early Christian church. And as the Bishop of Rome becomes more and more associated with the title of Pope, this is going to cause some confusion and some difficulties within the church. What are some of these issues that emerged as a result of the collapse of the Roman Empire? Well, even prior to the collapse of the empire, in Christianity, you have to understand that the early Christians were expecting Jesus to return almost immediately after the ascension into heaven. There was no idea of, it was going to be hundreds of or even thousands of years down the road. This was something that the Christians anticipated was going to happen in the imminent future. And so in early Christendom, there were many people who became hermits. They would take off into the deserts. Now this occurred most commonly in northern Africa, where these hermits would take off into the desert to prepare for the second coming. And as they became prepared for the second coming, they wanted to make sure that they were in the best shape to get immediately into heaven, that they were without sin, that their souls were cleansed. And so what they did was they established these hermitages within the deserts of Africa, where they lived in seclusion. And because they lived in seclusion, of course, they were celibate. And their lives revolved around this. They did not want to become engaged with or involved with other human beings. Their sole focus was to get into heaven. And this emerged during the 2nd century CE, the early 100s. But by the time of Augustine of Hippo in the 3rd century CE, it was a very common practice. And these were the very first monasteries. And because these monks, and it comes from monk, the word monk comes from the Latin word monicus, meaning alone or solo, and their celibacy became more prevalent within the western part of the church. Okay, they practiced asceticism. In other words, they lived a very, very astringent lifestyle. They fasted. They lived on, just the very basics of life, and they were shut off from life. They were preparing for the next world, the world that was to come. That did not occur within the eastern part of the world, what becomes known as the Byzantine Empire. Because when Rome collapsed in 476 CE, the Roman Empire itself did not collapse. And this is where the difficulty or hitch comes in. You have to understand this. Diocletian had divided the empire back in the 2nd century CE. We discussed this last week. He divided it in order to bring some control into the empire, because it was going into financial ruin, because it was too extensive. It gave more authority to the emperor who ruled within the West. So the empire was divided into two, just to stoke your memories a little bit. The Latin part of the empire was ruled from Rome, and the eastern part of the empire was ruled from Byzantium, which is the city that eventually becomes known as Constantinople under Constantine. Well, in the eastern part of the world, in the Byzantine Empire, the emperor was the sole source of authority. So he's going to be the sole control of the church, and the bishops answer to him. And that was not seen as untoward in the least. Okay, it also was the pattern in the West until the West happened to collapse. So now you have to understand that these bishops within the East are becoming more and more married to the idea that they are under the control of the emperor, who, by the way, was himself a Christian and the head of the Christian church. Now, that was not going to occur until Justinian, and that's not until the 5th century. As I mentioned to you last week, Constantine did not impose Christianity upon the Roman Empire. Christianity was a very small segment, a very small religious group within the empire. We think there's anecdotal information that Constantine converted to Christianity, but that has not been historically proven. There is no documentation to say that Constantine was a Christian. As I stated last week, we know his mother Helen was. We know that he stopped the persecution of the Christians, but we do not know that he himself ever converted to Christianity. And it was not until Justinian in the 5th century CE. At any rate, despite that, the emperor is still, as the emperor of the Roman Empire, has authority over all of the dioceses and everything that comes under the control of the empire. By the time of Justinian, the emperor is going to be considered a peer of the apostles. Now, this is very difficult for the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, to accept, and Pope Papa refers to father or head of the church. And so you see this breach now, this division that is occurring within the very early church. There are many, many divisions within early Christianity. There are many, many, many heresies that emerge that divide early Christianity. But the division within the empire is going to have the most significant influence on the division of the church. In the Western world, celibacy, which does not become a rule of the church until the 10th century CE in the Latin church, becomes more common practice within the Latin church. Celibacy has never existed in the Eastern church, nor has celibacy ever been ordered in the Eastern church. And so you'll see the priests and bishops within the Eastern church, the Byzantine church, are married. And that's accepted. The apostles were married. There is no documentation that says you must be celibate. That did not emerge until sometime around the 9th or 10th century within the Western church. And then we know that it was certainly not adhered to because there were the patter of little feet in many, many, many of the rectories throughout the Western world. So in the Eastern or Byzantine Christianity, celibacy is totally irrelevant to the priestly life. In addition to that, there were problems within the early church that emerged over the fact of how we're going to celebrate the Eucharist. Are we going to use unleavened bread as the Jewish people did at the Passover, as Jesus used at the Last Supper, or will we use the traditional bread that we share with one another, the leavened bread, where we just take pieces of it? And as a matter of fact, in the Eastern Church, the Eucharist was distributed by means of intinction, I-N-C-I-N-C-T-I-O-N, intinction. And intinction means that the bread is actually dipped in the wine and then dropped onto the receiver's tongue. And so just these differences are going to cause problems within the church. What may seem totally irrelevant to us in the 21st century, back in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, in the formative years of the early church, were very significant to the people practicing Christianity. And that's known as orthopraxy. What are the practices? What must we practice if we state we are adhering to the beliefs of Christianity? Now, this breach within Christendom is going to be aggravated in the 9th century, and it's as a result of the Byzantine Empire's constant competition, antagonism with, the Arabs, those people who adopt this newly forming religion that becomes known as Islam. And we're going to get into Islam next week in our final lecture because it has such a significant impact not only on the Middle Eastern world, but also its influences spill over into parts of the Western world. And it's also, we want to spend some time discussing why it's so misunderstood within the Western world. At any rate, in these early formative years of the Church, the Byzantine Empire is going to be in constant conflict, not only with the Persian Empire, but also the Arabs, the Muslims. Now, the Arabs are going to suggest that because early Christendom uses icons, religious figures, statues, that they are practicing idolatry. And of course, this becomes a very sensitive issue within the Eastern Church because it is not idolatry. They are not praying to these statues. They are not praying to these paintings. They are praying to the people or to the spirits that they represent. Jesus, God the Father, Mary, the saints. These icons, as they're called, these figures or images, denote something above and they're not certainly worshiping them. Now, why are icons important? Understand the period of history that you're in. Probably 90% of the world at this period of time is illiterate. And illiteracy does not lend itself to understanding all that much. So you have to be able to represent ideas in order to get ideas across to people. And so icons became very important in teaching people, if you wanted to convert people from paganism or from some other religious belief to Christianity, you had to be able to, in some way, indicate to them what you were talking about. And so this means of communication is going to become a real problem within the church. Since the Byzantine Empire is accused by the Muslims of idolatry, the Byzantine Empire revokes all and calls about, and why it's called iconoclastic. Certainly you medical people of your background know that clastic means to break down, such as hemoclastic, breaking down hemoglobin. What you want to do is he went throughout all of his empire and destroyed all icons and then demanded that the Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, follow suit and do likewise. Well, the Bishop of Rome refused to do so and persisted in using these icons. Now, the Romans were teaching different Germanic barbarian groups about Christianity, and so they had to have some means of communicating. So when the Pope refused to do this, there was a controversy that emerged within the church in the 9th century known as the iconoclastic controversy. And this iconoclastic controversy in the 9th century becomes, not just becomes the groundwork, but reinforces those differences that have already emerged within the practices of the early church. And so these are all going to cause problems to practicing Christians. and they're going to reinforce divisions that are ultimately going to cause that breach within Christianity, whereby the Latin Church and the Greek Orthodox Church will form. Now, I mentioned that Byzantium was in constant contact with the Arabs and with Persia. And the reason for this was the Byzantine Empire was a central player in long-distance Eurasian trade, and as a matter of course would certainly come in contact with these different groups, particularly the Arabs, who made their money through commerce. They were not agriculturalists at all, as were other parts of the world. In fact, they were not a sedentary group at all. And so they were constantly vying with the Byzantines for control of the commercial trade routes. And so Byzantium is going to have a very significant influence in spreading cultural influences throughout the world. It also is able to extend its religious beliefs beyond its borders to different groups in areas that we today identify as Eastern Europe. And these would be Slavic groups, Magyars, peoples who inhabit present-day Russia, the Ukraine, Crimea, and people in those areas. And they were influenced primarily by two monks, and those monks are very important for you to know. They were Cyril and Methodius. And it was Cyril and Methodius who actually developed what's known as the Cyrillic or Cyrillic alphabet that the Russian people use today and people throughout all of Eastern Europe. So this Cyrillic or Cyrillic alphabet is extremely important, but it enabled Cyril and Methodius a writing system whereby they could communicate to different groups as these various groups learned the alphabet, learned this means of communication about their religious beliefs and ideas. The important thing about the Eastern Slavic groups, particularly the Russian groups, is that they were important players in the trade world, and their determination to embrace what becomes known as Byzantine Christianity or Greek Orthodox Christianity is because they look at the Roman Catholic or the Muslim religion as too out there, and they want a little bit more say and a little bit more freedom in their religious choices. Now, there's going to be, I mentioned the Magyars and the Bulgars. Well, these were people who settled in areas that we today identify as Eastern European groups of people. But there were other groups that are going to start making incursions into this part of the world that we identify today as the Ukraine and Russia. And one of these groups are those people from Finlandia, from Scandinavian groups. They were the Vikings, the Finns, and other people from the Baltic Sea region. What these people do, particularly the Vikings, who make the incursions from the north, they come into an area around the Baltic Sea and create an entrepot. It's not a settled city, it's more like a trading post. And this area becomes known as Kievan Rus. And we believe that Rus identifies the Vikings and the Finns because of their red hair. They have a lot of redheads from up in those northern areas. And so these people will come into this development, this settlement, primarily for the purpose of exchanging goods. And of course, as they exchange their goods, their ideas, beliefs, technologies will also be exchanged. But this is going to be an area that's in and out, in and out, and in and out until the 10th century. So what you're talking about now is the 900s CE. when in 900, sometime in that time period, this area will become a settled port city. And it's from this area of Kievan Rus that present-day Russia will emerge. The one standout in this area who recognizes the potential, the possibility of making this a stable environment that will grow into a single political entity is known as Vladimir. He becomes known as Prince Vladimir and rules this area. Now Vladimir recognizes at this point in time, he's had enough of experience with the Arabs in trade to recognize their Islamic beliefs and the tendency towards control by, through religious beliefs. He also recognizes in the Latin Church that the Pope seems to hold total control. Whereas in the Byzantine Church, there seems to be a little bit more leeway, a little bit of laxness. They don't have to fast from alcohol that they do in Islam. They don't have to remain celibate as they do in the Latin Church. And so what Vladimir determines is that religion is very important for bringing people into common belief systems, sharing common ideas and practices. And so what he does is he himself adopts the Byzantine Christian religion. Now, you have to understand that when a ruler adopted a religion, it did not mean that he forced all of his subjects to practice that religion. However, you must look from the vantage of the subjects. If the ruler is practicing that particular religion, then perhaps it is to my benefit or to our benefit to therefore practice that religion. And so in these early times, some of you have mentioned that Constantine forced people into Christianity. He did not do that. People adopted these religious systems to make life a little bit easier for themselves. There were very few who were forced into adopting a religious system. Most people adopted these practices because it gave them not only a common belief system, but a culture, an identity. We practice this. We worship this God, but in doing so, we have these specific rituals around which we worship this God. And so it creates cultural identity. So you must get yourself away from that idea that people are forced into religion. Okay, so Kievan Rus will eventually settle, and there will be many people, Bulgars, Magyars. The Magyars are actually Hungarians, but people who will intermarry with those settlers from the north, the Vikings, the Finns, and create the cultural identity that becomes known today as the Russian culture. So that's the beginning of, and it actually began in the 8th and 9th centuries. I want to move now to Western civilization. This is a very interesting civilization that developed in the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire in 476 CE. That is the western part, the western half of the Roman Empire. So when Rome collapsed in 476, do you think that everything that had been Rome, that had been influenced by Rome, the beliefs, the practices that had occurred within Rome were just all evaporated? Not on your life. So what's going to occur within this western part of the world is a development of a culture that is based upon remnants of Roman society, Germanic groups who had had many years, if not centuries, of accommodation with and to Rome, intermarrying with Rome, and the Western Christian Church. So there are three elements now that make up Western civilization or Western culture, and they are Roman, Germanic, and Christian elements. Okay? So for thousands of years now, for 1,000 years, what you're going to find is this part of the world is substantially cut off from the rest of the world. The cities that had been emblematic of Rome just kind of disappeared. Why? There was nobody to keep up the cities. The cities were foci. They were places where barbarians raided. They plundered them to get all of the riches, the wealth from the cities, and then they took off back to their tribes. And so the cities pretty much fell into disuse and disrepair and became virtual ghost towns. So you have people now who are primarily living in tribes, and you have many, 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 many different tribes that inhabit many, many, many different areas that eventually become known as Europe. But each one of these tribes and the Roman traits that they persisted with and their adoption and adaptation of Christianity will evolve into specific cultures. So you have the Visigoths, you have the Ostrogoths, you have the Lombards, you have the Franks, you have the Angles, you have the Saxons, you have the Jutes, and the Celts, they were all in very different areas, but they all in some way were influenced by Rome and eventually by Christianity. Now, why did they adopt Christianity? Well, what did Christianity mean to these people? When Rome collapsed, there was no government organization. But there was one organization that had some type of political control, and that was the Christian Church. The Christian Church did not fall apart in the wake of the collapse. There were still dioceses. There were still bishops who ruled over these dioceses. These bishops and priests were the only members in the Western part of the world who were educated. And they were educated in monasteries. So they were able to read and write, some better than others. The bishops, of course, would be the best educated of them all. So the Christian Church is going to have an extremely influential part in the development of what becomes European cultures. Keep in mind that these European cultures are all going to be very individualistic. So while in the eastern part of the world, the Byzantine or Roman Empire or Eastern Roman Empire still exists, the Persian Empire still exists, you now have the Islamic Caliphate, which is basically an empire. You still have you have China that still exists as an empire. So you still have these civilizations that exist throughout the world. That does not occur in the western part of the world. The West is cut off from the other half of the world for about 1,000 years. The one area that has any type of authority at all is the Christian Church in the Western world. So now, how is the Western world going to manage? Well, there's a system that emerges within the West that we historians have designated as the feudal system. These groups didn't call themselves feudal system. They would never have heard of the term. This was an idea that emerged among historians that now designates a certain specific way of life that existed in the Western world from 500 to about 1400 or through the 1300s CE. And that feudal system was organized around a manor. Now, how did this occur? Well, in the Germanic tribes, among the Germanic tribes, or clans if you prefer, there would be someone who stood out as the chief. And so this chief then would emerge as the leader of the group. And so he would have control of or authority over a certain specific area. And under him, he would appoint someone, he would divide what becomes known as a kingdom. Okay, he divides that into independent areas that answer to him. These independent areas were ruled over by his appointees that became known as vassals. Then these vassals would, in turn, divide their area that they ruled over further and appoint vassals who were responsible to them. And so it was kind of like a pyramid system. There was someone on the top, the lord of the manor, which eventually they become manors. His vassals would subdivide their areas into separate fiefdoms, as they're known, and appoint vassals over them, and so on down the line. Now, in order to have some sort of control in the area, because remember, all of these different Germanic groups were vying with each other, competing with each other for control over certain areas of territory, you would have to raise an army of warriors. Well, how you would do that was by creating these fiefdoms, by stipulating that, you are my vassal, and it's your responsibility to rule over this certain segment of my kingdom. And as you rule over this certain segment of my kingdom, it's your responsibility to control that. And you would do so by raising an army to protect that particular area. And when called on by the lord of the manor, all of these different armies of these various fiefdom would merge to collaborate to go against one specified enemy. So all of these different Germanic groups, this was how they lived. This system, this feudal system, organized their life into community life. Now, another thing that it did, it provided economic stability, because I would have available to me a certain area for agriculture whereby I could raise crops to barter them for someone else for something that I needed, perhaps an artisan who created cloth, or an artisan who produced animal skins for either clothing or for water bags, etc. Okay, so the barter system persisted throughout this feudal system, and so there was economic stability, but there was also a system of political control whereby the lord of the manor, who ruled over this entire kingdom, was, in order to maintain your area where you put to agriculture, or that you were able to mine, or whatever it was that you did to procure your living, you had to pay the lord of the manor part of your produce, your production, that which you produced, in terms of, it would be considered a tax of sorts. And so it produced economic stability in that way. But it also created a means of indenture. I owe to this person, I owe him because he has leased me or subleased me this particular mine or this particular land that I put to agriculture. And so there were no slaves in the western part of the world, but there were people who were tied to specific fields of endeavor, tied to mining, tied to agriculture, tied to some sort of artisanry, and they became known as serfs. And they really didn't have the means to get their way out of this situation. They really lived pretty much from hand to mouth. And so serfdom would replace slavery in the western part of the world. And this would become more predominant in certain areas, such as Russia or Eastern European states eventually, but will ultimately die out in what became known as Western civilization. And there was a reason for that. Now, there is one figure who stands out within this early time frame, and that was Charlemagne. And the reason Charlemagne stands out is because Charlemagne was a man of vision. He was someone who had charisma, who had military might, who seemed to exude a lot of authority. And so he was able to form the one big stab at empire building during this early period, this early medieval period in Western civilization. But his vision, his ambition was going to lead to even further divisions within Christianity, and there's a reason for that. Charlemagne was crowned the emperor of the Roman Empire on Christmas Day in 800 by the Pope. Now, the fact that the Bishop of Rome, who's considered on level with one of the bishops of either Antioch or Constantinople or Jerusalem in the east, had the gall, the chutzpah, to crown Charlemagne as the emperor, really went against the grain of the Byzantine Empire, particularly the Byzantine emperor. It galled him. How dare this barbarian? Because he was seen actually by the emperor as a barbarian, which he was. Charlemagne could neither read nor write. And don't forget the Byzantine emperor, or the Eastern Roman emperor, was literate, highly educated, conversant in both Latin and Greek, and ruled over all of Eastern Christendom. How dare this Pope, who was no more than a mere bishop, crown this barbarian as emperor, when I am still emperor, even though my kingdom has been divided. Because the Byzantium always had the idea that one day the empire would be reunited. They never gave up hope for that idea. So this is going to reinforce in the Byzantine mind the negative elements of the Roman or Latin Church. So it doesn't do the Latin Church any favors, believe me. But to get back to Charlemagne now, so he's ruling now as emperor over Western Christendom, which includes what we today recognize as France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy. So that's a huge chunk of land. The problem with this, and Charlemagne rules for many years, but when he dies, his empire is going to fall into disunity. It's divided among his three sons, Lothair, Leo the Bald, and Louis the Fat. For one brief period in the early medieval period, the Frankish Empire or the Roman Empire will exist under Charlemagne. Now, there's one important thing that I should point out about Charlemagne before we move on, and was that the fact that Charlemagne recognized the importance of literacy. And so in his court, he developed an education system whereby he brought in monks who would teach the sons of, those who lived within the imperial palace, because he recognized that without literacy, there was no formal means of communication, of stability within the empire. And that brings us to the idea of monasticism. And monasticism played a very, very, very crucial role. And this is where the Christian church really stands out in its role in developing Western civilization. It was because of the monks in their monasteries that literacy at all survived in the western part of the world. What few documents they were able to salvage from the ransacking of the cities by barbarian groups throughout the western part of the empire were preserved by the monks in their monasteries and were copied in very elaborate style by monks who became known as scribes. And the monasteries themselves became centers of learning. So this is one area where literacy and learning will be preserved within the entire Western world. And since there were really not that many monks per the whole population, it was limited who would become monks, because it was a very austere way of life. They lived in celibacy, they lived very frugally. There would not be that many who would adhere to this lifestyle. So there were very few people who were available to preserve any sort of literacy within the Western world. As time advanced, you'll find that the fact that the nobility would engage these men. They would send their sons to live in these monasteries so that their sons could become educated. But for the most part, this was literacy was confined to these specific areas. But these monasteries, in addition to being centers for learning, also became areas for protection for people who were traveling from place to place. They would be a place of sanctuary where you could go if you had to travel from one place to the next. You could seek refuge within these areas. It would also be so eventually, as time went on, for merchants would seek protection within monasteries. But mostly it was people who had to travel, were forced to travel for particular reasons, would seek refuge within the monasteries. But the monks also engaged in studying medicine. Monasteries became the original hospitals where they, would perform types of surgery that they could. They studied medicine. They developed surgical techniques. That they were able to pass among themselves as well as to teach other people in their areas. They became the first mortuaries where people who were killed, their bodies were taken there so that monks could discern whether they had been murdered or if some illness had overtaken them. They were the first hospitals. You went here, or monks would bring you there if they found you on the road sick. So these became the first doctors in the western part of the world. They also became orphanages. In this particular period of history, it was not unseemly that if you could not feed all the mouths of your family, that you would leave your children out on the highway in hopes that someone would find them before the wild animals did. And monks would take these abandoned children into the monasteries, and they created what became the very first orphanages. So they were not just intellectual areas. They were they became scenes of scientific yeah, what's the word I want? I'm sorry. Scientific investigation. They would become places of succor and refuge. They were very important within Western society. Now, excuse me one second. I don't know why this happened. Excuse me one second. Okay, I can't seem not to want to go back to what we were doing here. Anyway, so I'll just continue from here. Okay, now about its forming alliances with kings. By that I mean early Christendom, because it did have a seeming system of influence and control within society, provided Germanic rulers with a system of alliance that they could form for themselves some sort of local, in their particular areas, some sort of authority for themselves. So what's going to happen now is in the Western world, as these Germanic groups declared their political control over specific areas of the world, for instance, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in France, the Angles and Saxons and Jutes in what becomes Great Britain, the Celts in Ireland, these different areas, what you have are groups who recognize the importance of cultural influence. So what they begin to do is to adopt Christianity in order to create a cultural identity within that specific group. So that, say for instance, the Ostrogoths within the Italian peninsula intermarry with Roman people and embrace Christianity. They now have the elements of what becomes early, in that part of the world, Italian culture. Same thing would be occur in France. The Franks, Charlemagne recognized this. Charlemagne embraced Christianity not because he had some epiphany and believed that Jesus Christ was his Savior, but because he recognized the influence of religion in its ability to influence and control people. And so thereby marrying a specific culture with a belief system, what you're doing is creating a cultural identity. And that's basically what happened in the Western part of the world, as it did in all parts of the world. But because of the influence of the church, you're going to have this Christian influence within Western civilization. And so this embrasure of Christianity imbued these leaders with a certain amount of authority because people connected them with the Christian church. And so these alliances between bishops and rulers became very important. Now the same thing that went on in Eastern Europe is going to occur in Western Europe. In Western Europe, you have Viking incursions from the north that occur throughout the 9th century. Now, what's interesting about the Vikings in the West is they don't settle in the West. What they do is they come in, and where do you think they attack? They attack convents, and monasteries. Why do they attack convents and monasteries? Because the Vikings recognize this is where all the wealth in the West is. They have these chalices, they have these ciboria, they have crucifixes, and they're all made of precious metal and some stone. And so they recognize that the value of these things, the material value of these things, not in their, certainly not in their spiritual value. And so the Vikings come in and they have these long boats that are very shallow, so they can get down up and down the rivers of Western Europe with no problem whatsoever, raid these monasteries. These 50 guys on this ship will come in, raid the monastery, and take off. So the Vikings really never settle within the western part of the world. You do now, however, have Magyars coming over from the east. And the Magyars are people that we associate with present day, like the Czechs and Bohemians, people from that area of the world. But you also have Muslim incursions that are going to begin in the 8th century. And we do know that the Franks were able to withstand the Muslim incursions for a brief period of time before they finally make their way into what it becomes eventually Spain in the 9th century. So there are a lot of different peoples from all different parts of the world who are creating the cultural identities of what becomes Western civilization in the early part of the medieval period, from 500 to 1000. This is a time between 500 and 1000 where there's very little global exchange. It's all very regional exchange that is going on. Okay. As you advance more and get into what becomes known as the High Middle Ages, and that is from the period of 1000 to 1300, there's a spike in population. And the reason that there's a spike in population is dependent upon the improvement in temperature and the fact that the area is very temperate and it's agriculturally productive. And we do know that there is some regional technology going on here, that the ideas of using the land more productively, of the three-field system method of agriculture, where you cultivate 2 areas of the land and leave one lie fallow for a season or 2 in order for it to regain its nutrients. You also see during this period of time there's a drainage of swamp systems that are put to agriculture. Pasturage. People become familiar with pasturage during this period of time. So there is, as improvements in agriculture are made, and where do you think the initial studies of these agricultural pursuits go on? They go on in the monasteries. They take place within the monks, the abbots, are very creative in developing these ideas and then spreading these ideas throughout the regions. And so what you have now is an improvement in people's lives because they have better food and there is a population spurt. But there's also now in the port cities within northern Italy an increase in global trade. So you have Genoa, Venice, and Milan who become engaged in trade with Byzantium, and as a result of that, have a connection to Asia. So as these northern Italian port cities become more important, okay, what they're doing now is introducing gradually into Europe spices from the East, all different kinds of products, aromatic woods, resins, products that they have been lacking for the past 500 years. And so therefore, there's a spike in interest in developing towns where trade would go on. You have a rise in what become known as fairs. And fairs are going to be the reason that towns are going to emerge. If merchants congregate in certain areas to exchange their goods, what do you suppose is going to happen? You have towns. Now, where do these towns emerge? They develop at neglected cities, cities that have fallen into disrepair, that are regenerated by those migrating now from the manors who are no longer needed. Now there's a surplus of people on the manors, and the lord of the manor is trying to get rid of his surplus of people, and so he gives them the I know what's the word I want, authority to leave the manor. And these people all settle in these abandoned towns that have been pretty much left as ghost towns since the collapse of Rome in 476. So what you see now is the advances in technology, and they are regional, and they are pretty much promoted through the monasteries as they improve agricultural techniques, and as the population balloons, then people are not required, but it's suggested that a lot of people, you can get out of here, leave the manor, and go settle and regenerate these towns. And that's exactly what happened. But what you have to understand now is, this is very important, these northern Italian cities are the means by which what becomes known as Europe, Western civilization, re-engages with the global community. But they're also the reason that the Western world becomes engaged in what becomes known as the Crusades. Okay, so what was life like in the Middle Age Europe? Well, it was pretty limited to those who had power and authority, the lords of the manor, and then, of course, as he divided his manor into fiefdoms, earls, counts, barons, and knights, and, an aristocracy amid it. So there was stratification in society. But in society, women were pretty much independent and pretty much were able to do their own thing in the early part of the of Western civilization. Now, as time goes on, women are going to become more and more inhibited in what they are permitted to do. Excuse me one second. Okay, there was one area of life that many people don't consider as very liberating for women during the medieval period, and that was the religious life. Because marriages were contracts, they were actually political contracts between a couple in order to intensify your authority, to gain more land, to acquire more prestige within your community. Marriage alliances were determined by your family. So women were often married off to men that they really didn't want to be married to. Not that they were exactly undesirable, though I'm sure many were. But women did not have the ability to choose a marriage partner for themselves. And so therefore what's going to happen is religious life becomes more and more important for women. And in religious life, it was not as you would consider today, you go off to a convent and live in this little cell, and it's a very austere way of life. As time went on in the Western world, even though convent life was like that initially, as women were waiting for the second coming, over time, religious life evolves into a place particularly for aristocracy to go who didn't want to marry. And they would take with them their maids, and it was a very hierarchical system within the convent. Those women of wealth had a very nice dowry that they took with them that sustained them through their lifetime. They had their servants. Their servants prepared their meals and did whatever for them. So actually, convent life was divided into two spheres. Those women who were poorer, who entered convent life, were known as lay sisters, and these sisters did all of the labor, scrubbing, preparing the meals, mending, that type of thing. Whereas women who came from the aristocracy became very much engaged in studying academic advantages. They were very literate, very intelligent. They wrote. We have examples of many women during this period of time who engaged in a lot of literary pursuits and were very productive. They were scholars and authors and artists, so they were able to develop their talents living in these convents. And that's going to end as time goes on and we get away from the Middle Ages and get into the early what's it called, modern period, when it kind of reverts back to the bishops having control over nuns in the convent. But the interesting thing about these northern Italian cities that were engaged in trade is going to be really, they provide the impetus for the beginning of the Crusades, because it is through these merchants from Genoa, Venice, and Milan and our connection with the Byzantine Empire that Pope Urban II of Rome becomes aware of the problems besetting the Byzantine Empire as more and more and more Muslims attack and gobble away, really diminishing the Byzantine Empire, so that eventually it loses even its breadbasket in Syria, and it becomes a matter of concern to the Byzantine emperor, not so much for religious reasons, but because he's losing political control in that area, control of the trade in that area, but specifically because he's losing the means of feeding his empire. And so he turns to Urban II and implores him, could you come to the aid of these of the Byzantine Empire. So what Urban does, he puts the Crusades, or these wars, in the context of holy wars. We have to regain the Holy Land from the infidel, and that becomes the cry of the Crusades. And what Urban does is he promises these Western warriors that if they go to the Holy Land and wrest the holy places back from the Muslim infidels, that they will go immediately to heaven. They will have total remission of their sin. And by that means, he psychs up the Western soldiers to go to war. But as in all history, you have to look at the underlying, there's something else underlying this. Winning back Christendom, the holy places, wasn't the only thing at stake here. What many of the Western people saw was the advantage of getting once again re-engaged in commerce in the Eastern world. So while the Pope's looking at it from a spiritual vantage, the soldiers are looking at it more from a economic vantage, though I'm sure some of them were prompted by this, this desire to win back the Holy Land from the infidels. But there's also another thing at play here. Urban recognized that these aristocratic men didn't have much to do with their lives except warfare. And so what's going on in the medieval period is there's a rise in these fairs where they have these, what we today call Renaissance fairs. They have these juists, and, they're riding against one another, these actually military engagements between two men where they're going to, fight to the death. And this is becoming rampant throughout the western part of the world. And so Urban said, like, to him, this was a sin that these guys were killing each other for sport at these fairs. And so he sees it as a means of, if you want to bloodlet, let's bloodlet someplace else and do it for a legitimate purpose, not that you're killing one another. So there are underlying reasons besides wresting the Holy Land back from the infidel. And so the Crusades go on for a period of many years. They actually, let's see, from 1095, so 200 years. The interesting thing about the Crusades, other than the first Crusades, where the Western Christians are successful in taking back Jerusalem and the areas around the Holy Land, which eventually they do lose to the Muslims, is that this was the only successful crusade. So the Crusades, in fact, did not win control of the Holy Land. So they were pretty much a bust for the Western world. The thing that came about as a result of the Crusades that you have to remember is that they re-engaged the West in the global trade network. Let's see, where am I here? Lost my place, guys, if you'll bear with me just for a second. Okay. I think I'm going to skip some of this because a lot of it is, I do want to talk about the terrible 14th century, but I'm going to go through it very quickly because we're kind of getting along here in time, and I don't want to hold you too much longer. Okay, there was a period of time known, it was the terrible 14th century, which was the 1300s. And there were three things that happened in that terrible 14th century. I'm just going to talk about them here. You can go through the slides by yourself. There was the bubonic plague. It started in 1346. This was the first pandemic in world history. It spread from the seaport of Kaffa on the Black Sea, which was an Italian seaport city, where the Mongols infected the Italians with the bubonic plague, and then the Italians took it back with them to Italy, and it eventually made its way through trade routes through parts of Europe, and then eventually into England, and even over as far as Russia. And what the bubonic plague did was it wiped out between a third and a half of the European population. And it's going to take Europe 100 years to bring the population back to pre-plague times. Now, what was important about the bubonic plague? It was an awful thing. You could actually smell yourself rotting to death. You would have buboes. They were called buboes. They were these big blister-like hemorrhages that appeared first in your groin and axilla, and then they would spread to the rest of your body. And what they did, you just stunk. You could smell these bubo were like blood clots, and the blood would collect under the skin, and it was rotting blood, and you could smell it. The stench was so bad, once you got the plague, it was almost a given you were going to die. And so what happened as a result of this was that families abandoned family members to die. They just fled. They were scared to death of them. What happened was they had to bury these people in mass graves. There were so many of them that died at one time. Entire towns were wiped out. But what it did was, as a result of the plague, it would end serfdom in Western Europe. Why? It ended serfdom because there were no workers left once the plague finally dissipated. And so if you were, say, the Lord of the Manor and you wanted some work done, and said, hey, Joe Blow, I want the South 40, the Gates plate put back up on the South 40, you'd say, no way, Lord of the Manor. You pay me. if you pay me, then I'll do it. And so wage labor came into existence and serfdom ended. That was the big thing. It was, think of the bubonic plague. It's the first global pandemic. It's the first, there's a lot of social disruption. And then it's the end of serfdom and the beginning of wage labor. Then you had the 100 Years' War. This was the war between France and Great Britain, or what at the time was known as England. Because of the practice of feudalism, the King of England, because of his Norman relationship to France, was actually a vassal to the English king. But what happened was there was a dynasty in France, the Capetian dynasty, that actually ruled for hundreds of years. That dynasty will eventually come to an end because there are no male successors to that dynasty. As a result of that, a distant cousin to the last Capetian king will claim control of the French throne. King Edward II of England declares that you cannot claim control. I am the son of the Queen Isabella, who was the brother of the King of France. I'm sorry, it's Edward III. I said Edward II, it's Edward III. He refused to pay homage as a vassal to the French king. And so what the French king did to punish him was to seize the last fiefdom or plot of land, parcel of land that the English owned in France, and that was Gascony, from the English king. And this is what precipitated the 100 Years' War. Now that's what seemingly precipitated the 100 Years' War. As I said in history, there's always something else. There's always, that's the reason that's put out there, but there are always underlying reasons. And the underlying reason was control of the wool trade. England had gone to pasturage as a result of the bubonic plague. In other words, it got away pretty much from agriculture and started raising sheep and goats, and became very much engaged in wool trade, and would ship its wool to Belgium to be processed into thread so it could create the cloth. Well, if they could not, if they had no foothold in France, then they lost their link to Belgium to get to control of the flax. I'm sorry, the wool trade, and so therefore there was this underlying economic reason for the 100 Years' War. Now, the 100 Years' War did not go on for 100 successive years. It was stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, because of, among other reasons, the bubonic plague. The inability of the English were fighting on foreign soil. They had to rearm themselves, regroup, bring supplies over from England to France. And they were, so the battles were, different battles through different periods of time. What's going to make the difference, finally, in the 100 Years' War is the emergence of Joan of Arc, who becomes known as the Maid of Orleans. Joan is able to bring the French into one cohesive group so that they'll finally attack the English in a very solidified fashion rather than piecemeal here and there. Now, the interesting thing about Joan is she'll be captured by the Burgundians. Burgundy was an area within France that was an ally to England. The Burgundians sold out Joan, and what they did, they were allies. Yeah, now I forget. But anyway, they captured Joan and handed her over to the English. Yes, they were English allies. What's going to happen is Joan is burned at the stake. So she really only heads the army of France for a couple of years But the reason she's burned at the stake is because she's considered a witch. And the reason she's considered a witch, if you think of the times, she dressed as a man and she was in the role of a man, leading men as a warrior, which was totally unacceptable in the culture of the time. And another thing was she's burnt at the stake. She's you know, the English claim she's a heretic, but the real underlying reason is because of her cultural going against the culture of what a woman should be during that period of time. Another reason for the end of the war is the fact that the French were able to acquire the cannon and the gunpowder, which had been invented. Well, the Chinese are given the credit for the invention of gunpowder, but historians actually believe that the Indians had some influence in creating gunpowder, and that the Chinese actually acquired that process from India and then used the technology for their fireworks and that type of thing. But anyway, the cannon, the French were able to gain use of the cannon, and that's going to drive the English from the 100 Years' War, and eventually the 100 Years' War will come to a conclusion. The final thing that's going to be a big problem in the Western world during this terrible 14th century is known as the Great Western Schism. And what the Great Western Schism basically is, the Pope, a French Pope, determines that he's going to leave Rome and to rule the papacy from Avignon, which is in present-day France. Now, the problem here emerges because the French were adversaries to the English, who were allies to the Italians. The French were adversaries to the English, who were allies of the Italians. So this causes a problem. The other thing is the French live in great deal of luxury at Avignon, and people are horrified, they're scandalized by what is going on at the papacy during this particular period of time. Now, eventually the Pope is encouraged to return to Rome at the encouragement of St. Catherine of Labouré, who is a nun. But once the Pope returns to Rome, he dies, and now the schism will emerge. And that schism is when the French return to France, they decide they're going to elect a French Pope. So you have now a Pope in France and now a Pope in Rome. So you have two popes ruling, and this becomes the Great Western Schism. Eventually, what's going to happen is the Pope will ultimately, I'm just going to run through here real quickly. The Pope will ultimately be just dethroned by a council that is called. And when that council is called, it deposes both popes and elects a new pope who reposes within Rome. Now, what's going on here is, in the Great Western Schism, you have people lose all respect for the papacy. There's a total disregard for what the clergy represent to the people, and they become very doubtful. So in the 14th century now, you have the bubonic plague that totally disrupts society, wiping out at least 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire European society. You have the 100 Years' War that decimates that area of the world that we call France today, and that's almost totally destroyed. And then you have the Great Western Schism, where people's faith in the moral authority of the Pope and clergy is totally undermined. Now, what this does, it sets the Western Europeans up for the Renaissance, the turn to humanism, the belief that religion is not all that important in their lives. And the idea of humanism advances during this period of time. So this concludes our lecture for this particular development of the Western world and Western civilization. And we will next week conclude our discussion with the rise of the Arabs and the impact of Arabs, not only in the Middle Eastern and Eastern part of the world, but also its effect on the developing Western world and what it has done to encourage the divisions within the world today. I thank you for your attention. I look forward to talking to you next week.